Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring how behavioural science can help mitigate human risk when it comes to transport. In simple terms, how we can make transport more human. But don't worry if you're not a train spotter or a transport addict. This is a show that is relevant to all of us. That's because every single one of us has reasons why we want to get from A to B, and usually we have to make choices about how we do that. Whether we walk, cycle, drive a car, ride a motorbike, catch public transport, or get on a plane. There's human risk in the decisions we make around how we travel, for us and for others. Equally, those who design transport policy, manage transport networks, and run travel operators also run human risk in what they do. There are lots of opportunities for both users and designers of transport to use behavioural science to think differently about what transport means and how it's delivered. My guest on this episode is Pete Dyson. He's a behavioural scientist who advises the UK's Department of Transport, so that's the Transport Ministry, on how to apply behavioural science in policy. And he's the co-author of a fascinating new book, Transport for Humans. Are we nearly there yet? The other co-author is Rory Sutherland, a name that will be familiar to anyone who's listened to this show for some time. Rory literally needs no introduction. You'll find him on 3 previous episodes of the show, and links to those are in the show notes. In my discussion with Pete, we look at what travel means and how our views on it are shaped by influences that might not immediately be obvious. He's got a host of anecdotes that I guarantee will make you think differently about travel and transport. And one of the things I find fascinating is that the ideas he shares aren't just applicable to transport contexts. We can use the same thinking for areas like compliance and ethics. Before we begin, an apology. There were some issues with the audio while recording, so the sound quality isn't as high as it normally is. But I promise you that lower quality audio is compensated for by really high quality content. So please enjoy my conversation with Pete Dyson on making transport more human. Pete, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
It's an absolute thrill to have you here. And look, I know all about you, but many of my listeners might not. So can you give us a little pen portrait of you and your career and interests?
Yeah, by all means. So I'm Pete Dyson. I'm currently a principal behavioural scientist at the Department for Transport. I've spent my career really working in behavioural science. So I first studied human geography with a strong sort of anthropological and cultural geography lens to it. I then joined the advertising communications agency Ogilvy in London, and it was just emerging that they were forming a behavioural science practice, at that time known as Ogilvy Change. And it was founded by Rory Sutherland and Jez Groom, who I worked with, and along with a handful of other colleagues over the subsequent 7 or 8 years, we built it out into a bigger behavioural science practice of about 15 of us. So I worked closely with Rory, who is the co-author of the book that we're about to talk about, and who has been a wonderful source of education and inspiration across the way. And this book is packed full of his insights and my insights, research and observation too. And I suppose as on the journey of writing this book, which its genesis has been about 4 or 5 years in the making, it felt like being in that sector of studying transport meant some specialisation was needed and warranted. And that was why I joined the department in about April of last year, which was a prescient time to join just as coronavirus was hitting. So when people ask me about how the job is going, I'm completely incapable of separating it from the sort of life, the pre and post life we were all dealing with, but having a really interesting time at the moment working on lots of very topical issues in transport.
And so for international listeners who may not have heard of the term Department of Transport, this is the UK government ministry, I guess, that deals with presumably all aspects of transport.
That's right. Yeah, all aspects of transport, of moving people and of moving cargo and freight, from pavements and cycleways to roads to airlines and ferries and freight. Worth saying, today I'm representing myself, and the book has been written in a personal capacity, and represents sort of science of what we know about passenger and people's experience of transport, rather than being a particular document on policy or anything of that nature.
And I have to say, I really enjoyed reading it because it really occurred to me that, one, transport is something that's relevant to all of us. Unless we are particularly sedentary, at some stage we are going to transport ourselves somewhere else and probably use some means of transport that goes beyond walking at some stage in our life. So it's relevant to each of us. And then there's a second piece from a societal perspective where we spend a ton of money building roads, railways, and other forms of infrastructure. So the subject itself is something I think we can all recognise and understand. And I was fascinated because you started to really dissect and sort of think, well, what does travel mean, and why do we travel, and what does it feel like when we're travelling? And it's really taking something that we all understand as a concept and exposing many of the experiences that we have, the frustrations, the joys, the reasons we do it, all of those things. Can you talk a little bit around how you sort of, how did you view transport when you were tackling this big topic? How were you thinking about that human dynamic?
Yeah, I think I arrived at the topic. I'm happy to say I arrive as a transport user of many different modes on many different occasions, and happy to say I come from some of the observations and frustrations, but also some of the joys of what it could be like. And I completely appreciate some journeys are functional and practical, and others have the opportunity for a deeper dimension. But being a behavioural scientist, when you scratch the surface and you look at the history of transport planning, it makes you quite nervous, really, because it makes you think we don't really have a lot of people aspects into the journey experience here. We've got a lot on how fast we're moving the objects through space, the speed of the mode of transport, and some important engineering goes into that. And we've got quite a bit on the cost element of bringing prices down, but we've not got a lot of the human aspect in between. And it's why we start by saying people are not cargo. And if you zoom out and take an aerial view of our streetscapes and our cities and our rural areas as well, you see it's not just dots moving about a map. There's people inside, and those people have, unfortunately for many planners, quite wild preferences. They vary from day to day, they vary between people, and people have different needs. And in a really optimistic account, I think we can do better. I think that by incorporating a better model and a better understanding of what people get out of transport, we can make the journey experience better. We can also plan our transport a little bit better to see how what features we invest in, what we might not invest in so much, and how we, seeing how climate change and sustainability rises to the fore, how we make more use of what we've got.
There's lots of examples, and the thing I loved about the book was it's sort of rich with little anecdotes and stories and things that we will all recognise, and even if we're not familiar with it, we'll sort of nod and go, that's really interesting. So differences between countries and perception. Can you just sort of talk a little bit around, how you look at? I mean, as we look at this concept of transport, you've said that cargo is not the same as people. Can you sort of just talk a little bit around, I don't know, maybe your favourite sort of transport anecdote that give people a sense of some of the sort of stories that are told in the book?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting process to look at how it's referred to. It's a bit unnerving to know that in the aviation industry, people can be referred to as self-loading freight.
That was great. I mean, depressing, but great, right?
A bit depressing, and explains why it can be cheaper to transport a person than it can be to transport a package across Europe, because the package you actually have to sort of log and move and put on stuff. The great thing about people is they mostly move themselves around, and they'll just put themselves on your plane and they'll take them off your plane. So they really are the self-loading and unloading freight of the world, but it goes a bit further than that, and there's probably a story that's quite interesting here in how we came to be the way we are, which is actually a really modern phenomena, as broadly economists of the 1950s and 1960s, in a well-meaning way, were looking to build and reconnect the world after World War II. And as a way, they didn't really have a structure to justify and understand investment. So what they turned to was what's called value of travel time savings. And there are some leading academics that put in some really good work to try and look at that. I would say, reading the accounts of of how this worked got out of hand. And by their own admission, just by the 1970s or 80s, they reflected upon saying, I'm really surprised at what we created, that we've walked into an area of complexity that's actually much harder to work with than what we were dealing with before. And before, there was a broader assessment of what the needs of transport would be. But once you start putting fixed numbers on saying, we're going to justify this because it removes 2 minutes off the average journey time for the average passenger or average driver, and therefore that's 2 minutes they won't have wasted on the journey because journey time is wasted time. And all this sounds sort of, in the modern day, I think, sounds kind of implausible. But it's where we found ourselves, and in the modern transport, a lot of it has been justified on that basis. Not all, by any means. But now we have the chance to think more broadly and more deeply and to integrate a much broader concept of what good looks like.
And, unsurprisingly, a lot of what you talk about is the perception of travel. And so you highlight, for example, the classic thing that anybody who's been to London will recognise, the London Tube, the underground map that's there, and how that drives perception, not just of the railway underground, but actually people's perception of reality above ground. Can you talk a little bit about that as an example of how the way information is presented to us changes our perception of travel?
Yeah, the front cover of the book. I'll let you judge a book by its front cover in this case, because we have a tube map brain, if you like, and it is a nod to what is really a great, what we call innovation, doing great power with the psychological discipline we already have at our disposal. And this innovation is to design a map that is more people friendly. And all maps are simplifications, but this tube map was a real step forward in saying, we don't need to represent the exact topography of London and put the map. It would be very, very hard to navigate underground. And when you are underground, you don't really need to know that. You need to know where your stops are. So the innovation is to straighten the lines out, diagonal, and then expand the core. So the space looks very different. So it's a brilliant invention. In a clever twist of fate, we say, we create the impression of London that looks that way, but it does rather. It still needs work and it still needs adaptation. So we're really enamored and really impressed with tweaks to the map that sort of personalize and customize it. Things like walking connections to show how you can overcome the things that look quite far apart but are actually just minutes walk apart. Things like highlighting different needs at different times. And things like showing, like customizing routes for different times and different occasions. So something that was really stood out as a way of showing the diversity of people's behaviour was actually a nice story of something that TfL have done, which was an inadvertent but nice upshot of installing Wi-Fi on the platforms. Not yet in the tunnels, but I do believe that's coming. But by installing Wi-Fi on the platforms, they could see among the people who had their Wi-Fi enabled on their phones and were logged in, they could anonymously track where they were traveling underground, which you would think wouldn't be that interesting. But it turns out all the data had been pointing at where people had been tapping in and tapping out, but didn't really know what people were doing and what routes they were taking. And when you map out, and the analysis was done for two major stations in London, Liverpool Street and Victoria.
And I love that because that used to be my commute.
Oh, okay.
And so it resonated with me because I was like, oh yeah, I've done that, and I can see why you do that. Why the hell would you do it that way?
Yeah.
So it was really resonated for me.
So listeners in London might already be thinking, oh, I know the answer to this one. It's this line and then this line, or it's obviously this or that. Listeners in other parts of the country or other parts of the world that aren't so familiar, you could project similar sorts of thoughts about other interconnected lines where you've got a set of choices. And it might be other choices about bus and train or taxi and ferry and all these other things. The curious upshot is actually only a minority of people, I think it was 45%, still the most popular choice, but not a majority actually chose the fastest route, which would be the Central line, followed by the Victoria line. So there's a change there, but they're both very fast, quick-moving lines. Many people chose to take the Circle line, which is sort of trundles along a little bit slower in journey time, but it's not got its nice, well-connected, air-conditioned carriages and rounded travels. Some people seem to go in the wrong direction. Some people went an extra stop further than you'd expect. There's a hodgepodge and messy set of behaviours, and what it shows is, there's some brilliance and there's some frustration to that. On the one hand, the engineer might say, this is people messing around and they're not using the trains that we provided with them properly. I'm a little bit more optimistic that there's some hope there that we can embrace that people have different preferences, and that this might be the same person traveling a few times on different days, taking a few different options depending on what they were feeling and what they were doing. They might have wanted to sit down, they might have been in a rush. And that actually we might all benefit from that. We might benefit from an embracing a diversity of choices, because if everyone chose the same route, the fastest route, then there'd be a logjam. And it's kind of what you see with car travel and with sat-navs that route according to strictly the fastest destination. It's not all great when we all choose the same. I'd also extend to say, when everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks very much at all as well. So we want some diversity, and some of that diversity I think is really prescient for the years to come, where you want a bit more resilience and you want an option and a backup option, and you want transport operators want to make sure if something goes down, they've got other ways of people getting about. So I think in that one fell swoop, and it's interesting that a little piece of data can cleave open a whole area of inquiry, where when we only follow the certain assumptions or the previous data, which was the tap in, tap out data, we get only a partial view into the into what's going on.
And the bit I find fascinating about starting to look at all these things is, obviously, if you want to make, and you make this point very clearly in the book, is if you want to make changes to public transport, the traditional logic is its physical infrastructure. So I will build new train lines, I will put new train, which is incredibly expensive overground, let alone if you're having to dig tunnels and do other things underground. And so this is and listeners who've listened to my episodes previously with Rory Southern will know the term psychological as opposed to logical. And Rory's point is we need to have some psychological solutions to problems. In other words, if we can influence customer behavior and people's perceptions of the network, then that's a much cheaper solution than changing the physical realities of it. And of course, that's in many respects far easier to do, because we just make small changes to certain things. And this is a topic that you explore quite frequently, is this idea of saying, well, we can be much smarter about changing the reality for individuals because we change their perception of it, as opposed to changing the actual reality.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. And it's definitely a yes and approach of saying sometimes we do definitely need more infrastructure and we need to run things faster, and we clearly we're not going to get very far if our bus strategy were to involve closing bus routes. Fortunately, we're doing the opposite, and new bus routes are opening more often for more people. But when we do that, we might also want to make sure we make the best use of what we have available. Some of that are solutions we could have done years ago, like making the network really easy to navigate, like communicating and promoting it at the right time to people when they're planning their journey, like making sure car drivers might also have the option and the understanding of the network, like users making it a little bit easier to plot with more salient route maps, easier to read numbers on the front. It's been shown in some of the UK buses that painting the bus route along the side of the bus enables people to be more confident and better understand the places it's going. And you might see this more on sort of coast hopper or tourist buses. But sometimes it's also about, and these are slightly technological ones, but nice ideas and sort of collective projects like the bus open data plan, where you can now get you can see in real time where your bus is and how often it's coming, how long you're going to wait for it, and give that assurance. So it's very much things working together, and it would be a costly mistake to only do one of those things.
And I really there were some lovely stories in there. For example, I think it's the Moscow Metro, where you talked about that they have it's a male voice for trains moving in one direction and a female voice for trains moving in. That's correct, isn't it? And therefore, it just intuitively whether you're going on the right platform or not without even having to look.
I think that's great, and I think I would love to go to Moscow just to experience and to hear that. Very clever, very subtle, and very much something the user in the first hand might not need to know, might not need any explanation, but might get the hang of. And I genuinely found exactly that. Was it 2 nights ago, coming back from central London, and a concern of, are we on the westbound or the eastbound train? And you have to look on the front and you have to think, and your mind goes a bit blank. But if simply you recognize the voice, it would make a big difference. Likewise, a nice extension is to see in Tokyo that each of the stops has its own chime and its own sound.
I was really embarrassed because I've been to Tokyo loads of times, and I never clocked that, and I'm now thinking back, it sort of makes me want to go there now to check it out. But I do recall there was lots of sort of noises and music, and I think now that you mention it seems blindingly obvious, but wasn't to me at the time. But clearly because I'm not Japanese.
That's true. You're not Japanese, and sometimes that's you're going into an interesting territory of sort of things that are useful to regular users. So this works really neatly for somebody recognizing their stop, that it empowers them to to lose sense of time and not have to track and not look up and go, have I missed my stop already? You're simply listening out for the sound that's familiar to you. A really, really clever innovation that not so useful to the first time user or the tourist. I think there's probably quite a lot more that transport might want to do in making that differentiation between its regular users and its occasional users. And there's lots of things that we experience that are really, really hard when you do it the first time, as if taking a new journey for people wasn't hard enough, as they've had to plan the route and think and navigate these strange spaces irrespective of what the mode is. But there's definitely things that can be improved for regular users to make it a little bit less harsh.
You came up with a suggestion which I thought was again just illustrative of the simplicity of some of these things, which is whenever we tend to exit stations, the exits are given numbers, which is of no use whatsoever to somebody. Whereas actually, as you point out, if you could say this was northwest or west, that would be really useful to have a sense of which exit I'm going after. I don't know, depending on where you start the numbering, one could be exactly where I want to be or exactly where I don't want to be. And I thought that was another fantastically simple, you're going to have to call these things something so that people can like each other different. So why not call it something that's useful to people that relates to the real world? And I thought that was a lovely example of something that if you step back and think about these things, it's such an obvious and simple idea, and yet it's something that seems to be missed quite frequently.
Yeah, and I almost get the impression with some infrastructure, certainly train stations, that some of these names and design aspects are a hangover from the people that have spent the best part of over a decade looking at the initial concept designs, the drawings, the architecture, and clearly then they probably would call it the Cromwell Road exit or the Liverpool Street exit, whatever it might be. But to the vast majority of users, that doesn't mean anything. And there's a lot that you could get by doing a walkthrough. And I think behavioral scientists really need to step up to the plate along with wayfinding, the wayfinding discipline, to try and build a bit more evidence about how that would work. At the moment, you've explained the concept that's suggested in the book really, really brilliantly and really simply. I mean, I think it comes from the insight that probably switching to a world now where the road name really means a lot less than the sort of north, south, east, and west compass seems a little bit full on, but people, even without knowing it, their maps are oriented north. So it really means which is the up way and the down way and the left and the right way. And all these are to overcome actually one of the shortcomings of a technology that's otherwise amazing, that it's still incredibly poor at knowing which way you're pointing, and describe that sort of if you're ever looking for a spot of Schadenfreude, you can stand outside any underground metro station or probably any stop where people are light for the first time, and they look left, they look right, they hunch over, they spin around, and then through just hit or miss, trial and error, they just start walking and they see where the little blue or flashy blob goes, and they'll walk 50 meters and then they'll find out which way through dead reckoning which way it goes.
It was actually funny because having read the book, I approached journeys slightly differently, which is I thought I'm now going to be smarter about how I do this. So I'm clearly not going to fall into those traps. And what was fascinating was, as with many of these things, is sort of you can think you're clever about it, but ultimately, to your point, right, I can't improve the quality of the little blue dots accuracy on my phone, and so I'm still trying to. So I was giggling to myself because, and I guess there's a lesson. I should know this from understanding a bit about behavioural science, is that even if we've got biases, they're very difficult to overcome. That was another example. I thought I'm now smarter as a result of having read the book. I will not be falling for that. And what have I done? Exactly the same thing. So I love that depiction because it rang true for myself, even having read it, let alone for somebody that hadn't.
Yeah. Oh, that's good of you. And I do hope that the book isn't written as a travel hacks for the average passenger, although I think that would be a great piece to write. There's a lot in there that really makes you reflect on journeys. And I think it's really it will be of interest to people that might have a stake in how transport runs, but might just be interested in the journey experience. And there's a whole third of it, what we call called when people travel, which is really pulling together the insights on the psychological biases on. And we talked about maps, and we might also subsequently talk about ticketing options and stress and perception of time. The whole bringing together the psychological literature that's otherwise scattered around in other places. So I think it's of general interest there. And
let's pick up that ticketing piece, because you talk about the different ticketing options that are available, and I wouldn't necessarily say the UK was at the most complex of options out there, but it's not particularly straightforward, and it is incredibly stressful trying to work out what ticket you need for what thing. Can you talk us through a little bit around the exploration of ticketing options and how that works, and how how would you do things if you were in charge of all these processes?
Okay, yeah. Well, there's one big number that strikes me and might strike all listeners, which is the number 55 million. Which is the number of different ticketing options there were in the UK rail fares in 2019. So 55 million different ticket combinations. And you can see how that could be achieved through the whole variance of different time of day and different traveller type and before advance and regular and all these different combinations. And it's all good, it's all well-meaning, but we've just created inadvertently a world of incredible complexity that stops serving necessarily the passengers' interests. It didn't really start serving anybody's interests. So there's been a strong initiative over the past, easily, I think, got to be at least 5 years of reviews to, in this case, rail ticketing plans, but it would apply to other areas, to simplify fares, make them easy to understand, to make them fair, to make the value clear, to keep them updated. And it's interesting that from a passenger's eye view, you and we all experience different modes, but there are certain sort of sector specific things that seem to create these incredible boundaries, which is to say, we experience very different ticketing models for our buses than we do for our railways, than we do for our taxis, than we do for our airlines. If you sit on an airline, it seems it's readily accepted that you are unlikely to have paid the same price as the person sitting next to you for exactly the same journey. And no one has a particular problem with that, because that's how airlines work. If you sit next to someone on a bus, you'd be kind of outraged if you'd got on with them at the same time and they paid X, Y, and Z more or less than you. And some of these are just hangovers from historically how the business model has been set up, but I think customers are starting to question why it is sometimes they pay up front, sometimes they pay after, sometimes they tap in, sometimes they only pay cash. And looking forward, it's going to be great to see a more unified model. And I think as we talk to other transport experts, there's been an incredible amount of furore that's only really coming to fruition now about what's called mobility as a service, which is where you start paying fixed subscriptions, or you start being able to pay one flat fee, or you start to be able to just tap in and tap out, and you're paying for something that's without needing to specify the origin and the destination and exactly where you travel. And that's going to open up a lot of different possibilities, some of which I think are really interesting to see. Why I've asked these questions of sort of, why does the traveller always need to pay for their journey? And this isn't to say let's have free travel for all, but often people are travelling in order under the behest and to serve somebody else's needs. So I travel to the office in order to serve my job, and my job serves my work better. So what if in the future employers might have a greater stake in paying for their employees' travel? That's not a particularly controversial claim when you look at things like company cars, but we don't really have company public transport fees. We have some support for paying for season ticket loans, but it doesn't really go much deeper than that. And there might be a lot more that could be done to help people make those more sustainable travel choices. But we might see it elsewhere outside of employees. Businesses have a vested interest, or like a leisure tourism. They all want to get you there, but it's always the person that pays. So we might see some changes, I think, in years to come.
And it struck me, I mean, you talked a lot about the impact of the Olympics on London travel, and I'd love to pick some of that up, not least just to reminisce about those times, because they feel very different from the ones today. But, there, when you bought a ticket, you got a free travel pass that would allow you to get there. And where I'm in Germany at the moment, many football clubs, if you buy a football ticket, you automatically get free travel on public transport with that built into that ticket. And so there's this interesting idea, as you say, that it's just sort of, well, how are you going to get to the game? Well, we want to encourage you to go by public transport and not get you to drive. Ditto with the Olympics. And I think this smarter thinking around, well, clearly you're going to have to get to the experience, and therefore as a user, not having to even think about that removes a whole degree of stress. So I want to, can you talk a little bit around further thinking around that, but also some of the points you made around the Olympics, which I thought was fascinating, about getting people to change their journeys and not have the big impact on London that was expected.
Well, I do think the two beer moths of coronavirus and climate change do throw into new light the fact that an individual's journey decision has implications for many other people in society. And that didn't used to be abundantly clear, but it's now clear that something like a football club would have a reason that they might want to get people to travel by public transport in order to lower their associated carbon emissions. And we haven't really seen that as a need before, but it's certainly coming in. When it comes to the Olympic Games, that was a small experiment, but turned out it was a world-class sporting event, but turned out to be a small but significant trial in disruption and habit and travel behaviour change. Some interesting tracking looked at people's working practices, and it was possibly a reason why London saw more flexible working in the years after, but some specific longitudinal studies that looked at people's travel before and people's travel after did find it was materially changed. They found new routes, they found new ways of working, because some people avoided the games, and some people who, while the games were going on, found new ways to travel. Now, a really interesting area in behaviour change, I think, now I recall the study, found that it asked a panel of people before the games if they thought they were going to travel differently. Some of them said yes. Some of them said, no, I'm not going to do anything differently. It then looked at how they did travel and asked them about their travel afterwards. And the people who said, no, I'm not going to travel any differently, changed their travel just as much as those that said, yeah, I'm going to. Which is to say, sometimes, I'm not going to say we don't know what's good for us, but if we were to only ever rely on polling people on what they were going to do, we would miss the much wider aspect that someone's travel choices are dependent on lots of other things. And it might be that those people said, no, I'm not going to travel any differently, hadn't got the memo from their employers that their employers were going to do things differently, or that their school was going to have different opening hours, or whatever it might be. Or that the other dependents, like the people they were going to travel with, changed their behaviour, and they stepped in to change along the same way. So we need to be really careful, and this is where a role for behavioural science comes in, to run trials and have a better understanding of, certainly talk to people, but also have a greater sort of scientific understanding of saying, what do we know about people's choices and how might they change?
struck me reading it and sort of reflecting on my own behaviour as a result of reading it, that our travel choices are actually incredibly malleable. And sure, there are going to be certain fixed things where if I have to be in the office at a particular time, I don't really have a choice. But in many other aspects, I can start to make different decisions if I have the incentive to do that. And I don't necessarily mean financial incentives, although that's clearly a key piece. But, for example, you'll take a slightly longer journey because you're in an air-conditioned carriage, or taking a different perspective. I can have a totally different view if I'm coming home and I'm not going to be in trouble if I'm slightly late, whereas if I'm going to work. So there are certain circumstances where we don't have that choice. But there are a lot of aspects of travel choices that we make that we probably don't probably don't recognize the full scope of choices that we have because they're not presented to us in that way. And so one of the themes I really took from it was actually I've got a lot more optionality. Clearly, if you live in a village and there's only one bus route, that doesn't necessarily apply. But if you're in a large city, there are probably more options than you might think, and yet they're not presented to us in a way that makes us think in those terms.
Yeah, I'll give one example, and then it really opens up a wider point. An example is like why, if you were marketing London City Airport, the clues in the name, a small airport in the city that serves the city of London, you might be wiser to try and get people to fly into London from it than out of it, which is to say, when you travel to an airport, you really want to stick with what you know because you're time strapped and you want reliability. But you might be willing to experiment on the coming back bit where there's less dependencies. So as individuals, we might want to think about when we make our plans, let's not be too harsh on ourselves and try and cycle for the first time to that new job interview. Probably isn't going to go very well. But when the going's good and you have the chance to try something out, then be kind to yourself and travel back. And I think there's a lot that travel marketing and travel planning could do to think a little bit more deeply about what occasions and how we're going to educate and skill people up. So this comes to this wider sort of second point. And there's a chapter called Travel and Mobility as a Skill that we don't really pay much attention to. The aspect that the way you use a bus or you use a train is skillful. It has all the attributes of a skill in needing to know the timetables, the routes, costs, just where it's going to go. These seem like fairly banal and simple things, but when we talk to children and elderly people, we see these as like quite big life moments when you first can travel on your own, and at the point at which you're no longer able to travel independently. So I do think there's a great need for this wider piece of research in what I call travel repertoires, which is to say, for a long time we've thought about how people travel in more a set of hierarchies. It's sort of, if you have a car, the car would be your first choice, and you'd say, why wouldn't I take the car? The next choice down might be ... depends on your situation. Whereas when we start thinking of travel repertoires, we start looking at a much, what I think, healthier, balanced diet of saying, I'm making this journey, what are my different options? Sometimes I do this, sometimes I do that. Much more flexitarian in its approach. At the moment, there's not an amazing amount of data that shows the number of different modes people take, but you only need to look at the sentiment and the angry discussions between people on Twitter, between drivers this and cyclists that, and why are pedestrians looking at their phones here, and don't get me started on the van drivers. Often that can all be one person. They do all these things, but when we perform those modes, then we get entrenched in certain identities. And it would be really helpful in planning. And you do hear this in conversations where people talk about the cyclists or the drivers. And ultimately, I think this is why the title needed to be what it is, Transport for Humans. These are all people in these different, going about their business, going about their days. And we should probably embrace, possibly, and I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast before, more the kind of a cockpit era thinking of saying, is it ever really the passenger's fault or the traveller's fault? It is, obviously, and they are accountable and responsible. But let's look at the whole system that creates it in the same way that it's not sufficient to look at problems and simply said the pilots did it wrong. We haven't learned anything there. We haven't dissected it. We shouldn't just chalk these things up as human error. humans are going to human, to use a sort of meme phrase, right? So we better get really fast to handle over how we work.
And there's a lovely thing that I just wanted to pick up, which is so blindingly obvious, and it hadn't. And I was like amazed that it hadn't occurred to me before, which was the old thing. And I'll stereotype here, but you sort of get cab drivers in particular complain about this. So they're giving up all this space to cyclists, and look, the cycle lane's empty. And the point you make in the book is that relies on a natural presumption that peak times for four-wheeled vehicles are going to equate to peak times for cyclists. And of course, you logically say, well, that's not necessarily the case. So just because the cycle lane's empty now doesn't mean it's not getting any use. But that's a classic, what you see is all there is. So you can see it's empty, so therefore it's a failure. But actually, maybe it's picking up traffic. And therefore, you talked a little bit around some of those indicators that talk about, that count how many cycle journeys there have been, which serve the purpose of keeping car drivers happy that at least somebody is using it, even if you can't see it, but also reinforce that social proof with cyclists. And I love this idea that it highlights of that perception. And as you say, sort of, if I don't understand the other thing, I'm going to draw conclusions from it. And I thought that was interesting, both from our perspective as individuals, but also in terms of how things are planned and how, the transport authorities go about thinking about those things.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And thanks for picking up on the cycling totem, as they're called. They're in a lot of different cities, and they're a simple bit of kit to measure the number of cyclists that goes past. And I think at a superficial level, it definitely seems like more encouragement for more cyclists, and it certainly is. And it's great to see the numbers fly up to hundreds of thousands of this, or you're the millionth and something person here. But it does have that second order effect of also communicating to motorists and people that are driving. Now, I think this goes into an even bigger point about perspective, and it does explain quite a lot of travel behavior when you start seeing that a given individual, if transport is a very public behavior, but each actor in that network doesn't know anything really about the other journeys people are making. I look out the window now and I can see people walking across the street and driving, and clearly as they're pulling into a supermarket car park, I can know that I have a good sense of where they're going, but I have no sense of where they're going to or where they're coming from. So there's not good quality understanding among users. And there are some interesting statistics that bear out there. I think I've seen numbers that this is for the US and for airplane flights, that a great majority of people on planes, if you look to your left and look to your right, you're very likely to be surrounded by people who take lots of flights per year, because most flights are taken by a small number of people. But that gives the false impression that lots of people take flights, where in fact there's just occasionally this person that takes the one flight a year for the one journey, which is to say, like, transport is mostly populated by people that do a lot of transport. We don't often get to see the people that just are popping out for that one time that week on that seldom journey that they've never taken before. And it would amaze me the number of people that I might have passed that I might recognize on my daily journeys that I have no insight of. How many times might we have passed a neighbor or a friend that's on there that we might not have recognized? But the landscape very much is an important one, because some aspects of the network really dehumanize people. And this is a sort of a take to wish that we could get away from not being able to see any more than the back of somebody's head. And I think that explains some amounts of the conduct that we see, when it's hard to be accountable in that kind of world. It's not something that people would normally have grown up in a society where they would be a little bit better connected. And as soon as we do share space a bit more, when we often see different behaviors.
And one of the points that comes out very heavily is the information about our perception, driven very much by the information that we're given. And you talk a lot about the tools that we have to be able to plan our journeys, and whether that's sort of price comparison websites for sort of longer distance travel, or whether that's just literally sort of Google Maps equivalents for shorter distance. The lens through which those tend to look is, as you point out, it's sort of seems to be important, and speed of travel seems to be very important. And yet there are lots of other dynamics that could be relevant, that could help us to have a better experience. Can you talk a little bit around that, what that might look like?
Yeah, it's very much a case of the system shapes us and we shape the system, which is to say, of course, speed and convenience are important for many journeys, on many occasions, for many people. But when we create a system where the ticket prices and the search system and the route planner makes the assumptions that it first brings to you the shortest, quickest route, and doesn't have access often to the data it might need to plot all those alternatives, and I'm talking about the most reliable route, the most scenic route, the easiest route, and this could be by car to navigate, the least hassle route. It's really great to see companies like Citymapper starting on the way there to having the rain-free option, which is, clearly always undercover. And there's quite clever to work out the ways in which that's done. And probably foremost of which is the least busy route and the least overcrowded route. If we were to rely only on the narrow assumptions of speed and time, then we start warping the market and people start picking, hey presto, by the thing that it's ranked by. And we know that from choice architecture that people are inclined to go with default options, and they're inclined to pick the top choices. Sometimes it frustrates users and frustrates people that they can't tap into that database a bit more clearly. Which is to say, we make the assumption that the user knows when they want to travel. I think it was my mum just a couple of weeks ago was intrigued by the launching of the new London to Edinburgh train service under a new operator. She wants to take advantage of that service and have a look at it, but was frustrated that she had the first choice was which day do you want to travel. Okay, so that wasn't really the factor that was going to make a difference, just wanted to know the different ticket prices and didn't know the day. So the order in which we pick defines a lot of the choices that we make. In the future, it's quite possible somebody wants to pick purely because they want a quiet, undisturbed carriage, and they want to understand that. So it's probably for behavioral scientists and engineers to really work together to see how we can get that data and equip the data, which is to say, when do we know how people travel? Are we able to present that information on seat reservations or in special services? I've experienced exactly the same in needing to transport a bike, where you transport it on the train, but you need a bicycle booking. The first thing they ask is sort of which service you want to travel on. You go, I'm not sure.
Well, you tell me, right? I'm not fitting with you, right? Yeah,
I will fit in with you, yeah. And it's quite painful to need to go through until you get the sort of on the ninth occasion, you find the one that has one space left, and you go, that's fine. Obviously, it's not top choice, but it's hard to efficiently allocate space. And again, the thrust of the book is let's do the most with the power of what we've got, in any form that it takes.
And as I sort of keep saying throughout this discussion, there are lots of things that you have sort of made me aware of and I've thought about. And there was one example recently where I was traveling with my partner. We were on our way somewhere with a load of luggage, and we needed to change tube trains. And I kind of was looking and thinking, well, where are we going to? And actually, I ended up randomly picking an example where literally the transfer was walking from one platform through a little tunnel to another one to change trains. Now, that was incredibly, I was panicking. I'm going to have to carry the luggage upstairs. I'm going to be in real trouble here. And it turned into, through no genius on my part, to be the most simple. And it was afterwards, I just thought, actually, it'd be really helpful if you could just pick by least amount of walking with suitcases, right? Would be a fantastic piece. And I would even travel on a longer journey to do that, to avoid the stress and hassle and sweat, and particularly during the rush hour. And I think there's a ton of these sorts of, as you say, the information exists. It's just a case of presenting it to us. And that I was almost so relieved that the journey was almost a pleasure as a result of that one brilliant decision. But that was completely random. And so I think it's a good example of sort of, a type of journey that's very different if you aren't carrying luggage. And yet that's not a criterion that's ever captured. But step-free access is captured very often, but not the sort of, I've got a lot of suitcases to carry, which is a very common thing, and particularly for people that are not familiar with the city. And if you're on holiday, you've got more time. So that is, again, another example of something that would be really easy to think about, probably slightly more expensive to implement, but nonetheless useful information that would prompt. And you don't want people blocking passageways with suitcases. So why not make it easy for them to free the network up?
Yeah, it's very much a sort of untapped potential and some extra horsepower we have in the engine already by displaying information at the right time to the right people. And in this case, sort of cross-platform interchanges are a great advantage that the regular user and the loyal user might get to know really well, but new users don't. And I think this taps into like a big part of the third part of the book, which really has a whole chapter dedicated to the tyranny of averages and the danger of designing for the average person. And sometimes the average person doesn't actually exist, genuinely doesn't exist. It might be full of people who only use you once and full of people who use you 10 times a week. Nobody uses you 5 times a week. That is probably a rough approximation of quite a lot of the commuter journeys done pre-coronavirus. And yet now we flip around and the average might look sort of similar, but obviously the distribution is really different. And the tyranny of averages is that if you design for the average user that uses you quite a bit, you miss out all the empathy and all the important aspect of making a journey for the first time. And that new user is a really important person to get involved. And when we're unsympathetic to the mindset of the new user, we really do them a dissatisfaction. And that's to say, a lot of journeys are stressful. They're carried around with stress, not just of the journey. I think the journey sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap, but it's hard to leave for holidays. It's hard to pack up all your things. It's hard to start a working day, or it's hard to go to a stressful destination, or it's hard to just meet someone you haven't met for a long time. All these things are quite emotionally charged areas, and until we understand how people might sort of react, and they might spill over those emotions into the stress of the anxiety of being agitated about things like the sort of what if machine goes off, and what if I miss that? How's the interchange? How long am I going to have? Oh my gosh, it's only 5 minutes. Will I be able to get across in that time? Same goes with car journeys of uncertainty over journey length and journey time. Then we miss out. We miss out a lot of opportunities for people to take those journeys. There's just a commercial miss. The customer satisfaction goes down, but in the bigger, wider scheme of things, we're underusing often important public transport, where at that point of decision making, it gets easier to say, "Oh, stuff it. We'll just call a cab, or we'll just take the car as we have done typically."
And one of the things I thought was absolutely fascinating was you talked a little bit around, you had a conversation with people that design trains around what it would be possible to do, because as you explore, typically trains all look the same. And there's a limited sense of imagination seemingly deployed around what that would be. And you reference the fact that certain trains don't have tables, which makes it a little bit difficult for people with laptops who want to work in the situations. But you talked a lot about there's huge potential there, and yet the rail operators don't seem to take advantage of that. And so when we look at it, we sort of think, well, they're not very imaginative. These people that design trains are not imaginative. It's not the people that design the trains that are not imaginative. It's the people that are doing the purchasing, and therefore that's what we see. Can you talk a little bit around some of the permutations that are available that we could have if transport operators were to think in slightly different terms?
Well, there are some brilliant and at the far end, some weird and wonderful ones. We'll start with that of different train combinations of sleeper carriages. But even if you travel on a train in Switzerland, you might find there's children's play areas on the top deck. They've experimented with game zones on the last, where you're playing fully fledged games consoles. Obviously, through the years, in the UK, we're not so familiar with the dining car, but still exists in Europe. There's some different train combinations, and more are coming out. And I think the conversation is changing with a shift to leisure travel as a dominant mode, and a sort of flattening of peak time travel, which I think it's fair to say is a surefire that the peaks will spread out under a more flexible mode of working. That there was a bind, and I think you need to be. We try in the book to be really empathetic and understand the situation in rail procurement. You've got to buy this thing. It's millions and millions of pounds. It needs to last many decades, and it needs to serve you on. You can't just switch it off and leave it in the sidings. It needs to run all day, and it's going to serve some peak time passengers where it's going to be full, and then it needs some other, and then it's going to be much quieter. So we kind of get, but when you start from that basis, you kind of get it, but you go, could behavioral science make a stronger case, and are we fully equipping designers and engineers with the sort of what's it worth to make that slightly more dynamic option where a seat folds down, or a table option can be brought in or brought out, or cycle space can be added and removed. I think we're struggling at the moment to see where there are appropriate experimental techniques to say this is the cost, but these are your sets of benefits. These are the sorts of people you attract. This is how easy it will be done. And I've no doubt that there's enthusiasm in engineering to start making more modular designs, but we kind of need to work to make it happen. Some aspects that you certainly need to, or probably worth looking at, are elements of train design about just these are less the trade-offs to be made in the harshness of lighting versus the eases of wiping down seats and the thickness of train cushions. I think I've heard it remarked that Americans, as they come over to the UK, are surprised at the cushiony seats of the London Underground, where they're used to the hard plastic sort of spray down of the subways. I remember it from the US that it's more jarring, and it sends a different message, as well as it being a little bit different to sit on. So I think there's some optimism, and I've seen a lot of different train carriage designs, but in the book we just touch on how that procurement comes about, and how interestingly, unbeknownst to a lot of us, these are owned by pension companies, not necessarily in the UK. They've got a long-term stake in it. And the book touches on the importance of defensive decision making, and explains why you're more likely to design for average when, in the absence of the quality sort of experimental evidence, that you're set upon some agreeable facts about how actually probably we should prioritize just fitting as many people into our fast moving cans as possible.
Fabulous stuff. And having inadvertently traveled on the Hello Kitty Express in Japan, I can tell you that having something slightly quirky does make the journey go there. Well, it doesn't necessarily quicker. It's just it's a memorable, pleasurable experience, which reinforces that. Look, that fantastic stuff in the book clearly comes highly recommended. So I'll put links to that in the show notes. But I cannot let you go without talking about an amazing journey that you recently took, which was to cycle one heck of a long way. And can you tell us a little bit about that journey, and explain to listeners who maybe haven't been to the UK exactly what this involves, and give the names of the start and the finish point, and talk a little bit about what you were thinking?
Yeah, okay. So where do we start? Well, the UK has a wild history of cycle racing and of cycle endurance challenges. It has a set of point-to-point sort of record distances, and I've been a competitive, let's say semi-professional triathlete, so swimming, cycling and running, and a very competitive cyclist to boot. And I set about seeing if I could break the national record for cycling from Land's End, which is the corner of Cornwall at the tip of the bottom of England, back into London. And the specific point was at Hyde Park Corner. And that's a distance of 290 miles. And I did it all in one. I set off at about 9:30 a.m. I arrived there just after 9:30 p.m. So it took, or just before 9:30 p.m. It took just under 12 hours. I was stationary for about 12 minutes of that time. And I did so on one of those space-aged carbon fiber bikes with all the trimmings that you'd come to see more often in the Olympics, but built it up myself as a sort of second-hand project, to be honest. and did my own study and had timekeepers following me to keep me safe along the way.
And it was beautiful because you, as one does nowadays, put all this on social media so people could track you as you were doing it. And I remember, thinking, I thought I'd misread because it sounded like an absolute lunatic endeavour, and yet entirely on brand for your interest in travel and cycling. What did you learn by doing that? Because I mean, to the average person, right, who, you know, whether you do any cycling, that's an insane distance to do in one fell swoop. But what a lovely idea, particularly given your interest in transport.
Yeah. Well, they say, you know, you're always like your trip back from Cornwall is always going to be that's going to be mostly a day. That's the day gone. Well, might as well make it a day fully spent, right? I was still home in time for a late dinner, but I did want to show. I did think I was really overwhelmed by the response of it, and I've done other sporting competitions, and it's just different. But I did want to show the power of the bicycle, and it's really, really impressive, the efficiency that you get and the many different ways it can be used as transport and as sport. And I think I like that interplay between those things, that only a few people need to be crazy enough to sort of show what can be done. But it makes you think. And the aspect of a record there was a lot of risk and decision making in there. I think it would be an interesting case study for somebody to work out. It's definitely a world of trade-offs. The huge factor that can often go unknown. And some people said, "Oh, sorry about the weather, but I hope you're okay." I said, no, the weather was the main thing. That was what I was optimizing for. Having that following wind is really, really important, and made me think differently about how I approached events. Typically, you look at your own physiology and you say it's all about your training and all that. I honestly ditched a couple of sessions on a few weekends in the lead up to it to look at meteorology and look at the weather forecast, because this is part of breaking a record. You need to work out how to get yourself from it, and you pick a windy day where the wind will help you. So I think I got more gains out of picking a good day than I did out of training. And sometimes you need to be flexible with. I think it teaches me, and a lot of this comes, I think, through in the book. You know, be mindful of your assumptions that you carry over from another domain. And I think I'm bringing it back to transport now, but we make assumptions about saying, well, of course, we're going to want to make it fast. We want to reduce the journey time. And you go, maybe we do, or maybe we want to also look at other things that affect the outcome and the performance. Here, it's good that you can really define quite clearly. It's like by hook or by crook, how we're going to get there in the shortest amount of time. But there are some things where you're then making other trade-offs about reliability. So the cycling geeks will know that you can run faster tires, but those tires might be more fragile, and now you're in a slightly more difficult to square off situation. Or you could try and eat more ambitiously, but if you eat too much, you'll feel bad. Or you could try only drinking just the right amount of fluids, but then it might come back to bite you. Or clearly you could try too hard at the beginning optimistically, and then that'll come back to bite you. So fortunately it played out, and I'm really pleased that you've asked, and I'm really pleased it went well. But I'm well aware that in another set of universes it didn't play out that way, and maybe I didn't get to the start line, I was ill, I didn't get that opportunity, something went wrong in the first few hours. So much is so contingent on so many things, and while it seems like an out and out solo attempt, you definitely immediately get the feeling that you really rely on other people, rely on the following car to keep me safe, my team car to provide nutrition. I needed a few people to say it was crazy but not that crazy, and be supportive. And likewise in many other endeavors, we should never really build a castle around ourselves. We do definitely dependent on other people to make stuff happen.
Suitably modest as ever, because it's frankly it's one hell of an achievement, and congratulations, because it was a beautiful thing to observe. And I love that so you neatly highlight outcome bias, because the record books will show what the record books show and none of the things that have gone into it. And it could have, as you say, for no fault of your own, could have shown a very different thing. So I think there's a lovely example there that when we look at sort of Olympic records and other things, there's a ton of things that we don't see, and we focus what it finally says. But fortunately for you, all came good. But I have a sense that if it hadn't come good, Pete, you'd have been back having another crack at it. Is that right?
Yeah, you got that about right. And you might. It's a good sign, but it's good when people say what's next. People ask what's next with the.
That was going to be my next question. So what is next?
Yeah. You go. Give me a break. Maybe a day or two off. But sure enough, I think it was about 3 days later. To be honest, I started looking at other cycle attempts, and I'll probably do something next year. That's another. I won't say where and when, but another thing that looks a bit similar. That's maybe a bit further. And some of this is about pushing. It's you say it's nice of you to say humble. I really did just go into it. You don't go into. It'd be madness to do it for the grandeur and the status. Partly because it doesn't usually work out. It definitely just comes from that itch and that question of wondering if could I do it, and trying to answer the questions. And you'll see this when you speak to other endurance crazy people that they just struggle to sleep at night without being able to go, could I do it? If I did, how would I do it? Would I be able to sustain this or that? It's about the personal challenge and the journey. Otherwise, you definitely give up.
And it struck me actually. So I talk a lot around human risk topic of just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think this is a lovely example of where that rule probably doesn't apply, right? So just because you shouldn't doesn't mean you can't. And so it's a lovely sort of counterweight to that. And I think sometimes we need people to push the boundaries and do things that the rest of us think are a little bit lunatic, because therein lies, arguably the Darwin Awards at one end of the spectrum, but the opposite end of the spectrum is progress and joy in human endeavor. And you've absolutely provided that. So to wrap everything up, firstly, thank you for writing the book, because as I said, as a travel user, it's made me think about things. It's made me, in some respects, I have to say, get a bit more irritated, because I look at it and go, why haven't we done a lot of these things that you highlight? So I really hope that people with the ability to do that. But I think even for the average person, average user of public transport and just human beings, there are some really useful insights, both in terms of how we think about travel, but also some of the things. I'll be using many of the stories that you've featured in completely different contexts to explore human decision making. So comes highly recommended that saying. Remind us what the title is and where people can get it.
Oh, yeah. It's called Transport for Humans. Are we nearly there yet? It's written by me, Pete Dyson, and Rory Sutherland. It's published by a wonderful publishing company called London Publishing Partnership, who have a great series of books. It's called their Perspectives series. And it's available on their website with a lot of other really interesting ones about housing and about Bitcoin and about many other topics. But it's also on Amazon. And it comes out on November the 18th, of 2021.
Fabulous stuff. Pete, thank you so much for appearing on the show.
Thank you.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Pete for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about his book, Transport for Humans, Are We Nearly There Yet? Have a look in the show notes. There are links to that there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star rating for it, please do. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode in this series, but in the meantime, do visit human-risk.com to find out more about human risk, the work that I do with my clients, and for useful human risk resources, including the newsletter, video blog, and other content that can help you think about managing human risk in your organization. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, travel well, and thanks for listening.